We've all done it. None of us wants to talk about it. Emesis, vomiting. The anatomy of vomiting is interesting and clearly important, and my daughter loves reminding me that horses cannot vomit, so you have to be very careful what you feed them. So it's something that has developed because it's useful, right? And the action of vomiting is a coordinated sequence of events. The complicated bit is there are potentially lots of inputs. I don't need to tell you what makes you feel sick, although I'm probably going to give you some examples anyway. But those inputs must all get in. Okay, the reflex is in the brainstem. All of those inputs go into the brainstem. In the brainstem, there are some centers that organize this response. And then we have the out. So again, it's another brainstem reflex. We're going to look at some of the sensory inputs. We're going to look at the nuclei in the brainstem where the reflex occurs, and then we'll look at the motor outflow and the sequence of events that causes vomiting. So vomiting is useful for us. And to give you a few examples then, pathogenic bacteria in your food can cause vomiting. An upset of your vestibular system in your inner ear, your system of balance, either through, say, an infection or being on a boat in a heavy sea, can cause vomiting. Sticking your fingers down your throat, so physical, like touching parts of your pharynx, can also cause vomiting. And hey, with me just talking about it and my notes that I've been putting together, reading about it, just thinking about being sick makes you feel a little bit sick. So there are components to this. There's nausea, there's nausea, and then there's dry retching. Yes, we're going to talk about that. And then there's emesis, there's vomiting. Anyway, let's talk about the actual, or some of the sensory inputs first. You've eaten some food. Okay, let's not talk about you. Let's pretend this is somebody else, not us at all. Food has been ingested. And here's the stomach. So pathogenic bacteria were in that food, and they're now in the stomach, and they've possibly also started to pass into the small intestine. Those can trigger vomiting. So there are sensors for that in the gut. Also other, poisons, toxins, other things that might have entered the gut. There are receptors, there are sensors to detect those. So there are sensory apparatus in the stomach and the small intestine. And so we're talking about visceral afferent neurons. So sensory neurons from organs are passing back to the brainstem. There are two routes they can take. They can run with the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve will be running with the esophagus here down to the stomach. So those visceral afferents will run as part of the vagus nerve up the esophagus and then up the neck between these two blood vessels to get to the brainstem. We will talk more about the vagus nerve because it's a big player here. Sympathetic neurons come out of the spinal cord at thoracic levels. Now, some sympathetic neurons are motor, but visceral afferent fibers, sensory fibers, might also take the same route back to the spinal cord and then up the central nervous system. So we're talking about visceral afferent fibers, sensory fibers detecting these things in the stomach and the small intestine, running back through these two pathways. Here's the thorax. I've taken the lungs out. There's the aorta, here's the esophagus, there's the diaphragm there. So there's the left vagus nerve. The left vagus nerve there is running up the esophagus, and likewise the right vagus nerve is running up the esophagus there, and here we have those sympathetic neurons. Now the sympathetic neurons, like I say, they're not carrying sensory stuff, they're carrying motor stuff, but sensory neurons might follow the same paths because nerves tend to be mixed. They tend to be sensory and motor. So the vagus nerves run up the esophagus to the neck, and then they find their way to run with the common carotid artery. So the internal jugular vein is here as well. So the vagus nerve runs up with those two major vessels up the neck, and then it follows the internal carotid artery up, really it's following the internal jugular vein, because the vagus nerve is going to go through the jugular foramen, which is where the internal jugular vein comes from. So cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, is probably certainly carrying a lot of that sensory information back to the brainstem. Now here's the head. So here's a mid-sagittal section through the middle of the head and the neck here. There's the airway, so the trachea and the larynx, and the esophagus is squashed back here, it's compressed back there. There's the oral cavity, there's the nasal cavity, so this is the pharynx. Now, some of the pharynx sensory information, so now we're talking about somatic sensory information, sensory stuff that you're aware of, right? Like the sensory stuff when you touch your skin. So somatic sensory innervation from the posterior parts of the oral cavity and the oropharynx are carried by the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 9, back to the brainstem. And as we go further down towards the laryngopharynx and the larynx, sensory information from here is carried back to the brainstem through the vagus nerve again. So we were talking about mechanical stimulus of this region also being a trigger for vomiting. So it's the glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve which are potentially carrying that sensory information back to the brainstem. And then the inner ear, the vestibular apparatus in there, is sending its sensory information to the brainstem through the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. But we also have all of this, don't we? We have all these cerebral cortex functions. There are triggers of emotion and disgust and smell and sight. I'm not going to elaborate. I think you know what I'm talking about. That can also make you want to vomit or make you vomit, right? So there are, like the limbic system is involved. So higher centers, central centers, are also tied into the brainstem and can trigger vomiting. And, okay, so here's the brainstem. There's the cerebellum. This is the cerebral aqueduct here, so we have cerebrospinal fluid flowing through there. And this slightly larger opening there, that's the fourth ventricle. Now, in the brainstem, so medulla, pons, midbrain, in the medulla, in the floor of the fourth ventricle, that's where we find chemoreceptors. So we talk about chemoreceptors as sensing stuff in the blood. We've talked about reflexes where chemoreceptors detect the pH of the blood, dissolved carbon dioxide, oxygen, that sort of thing. Chemoreceptors here can also detect other chemicals like pharmaceuticals or drugs or toxins that can also trigger vomiting. A good clinical example of this is opioids. Morphine is commonly used for extreme pain relief, high pain relief, but it can trigger nausea in some people and vomiting. And that's why, because there's another central receptor mechanism here that can trigger vomiting. Now we're here, now we've made it to the brainstem. There are vomiting centers in the medulla that will trigger motor outflow and the movements of vomiting. Maybe we should describe what those movements of vomiting are, right? So typically the first stage is nausea. You know what it feels like, I think. I don't have to describe it to you. And what's happening alongside those feelings, that sensation, is the stomach is reducing inactivity. So the stomach is becoming less active. And here we have the small intestine, right? So the stomach sends its contents into the small intestine. We have the duodenum here. The small intestine, so peristalsis is the mechanism of the circular muscles and the longitudinal muscles squeezing the contents in this direction. Well, with nausea, you're probably starting to get some reverse peristalsis, and whatever's in the small intestine is going the other way. It's going back into your stomach. So nausea, reduced motility of the stomach, and reverse peristalsis of the small intestine. That's stage one. The second phase is retching or dry retching. It's a very onomatopoeic word. Okay, so with retching, up here in the larynx, you have muscles that control the vocal cords, and you can close the vocal cords and close the larynx, close the glottis, that's the airway at that level. That lets you do two things. That protects the airway, stops things going down the airway, and it also lets you build up pressure in the torso. So the glottis closes, and the stomach, probably the antrum is this bit down here, this widening. The pylorus is down there, the antrum is here. The antrum probably starts contracting to prepare for the final stage. So it's actually pushing its contents that way. This relaxes, the antrum contracts. And you start to get the movements against a closed glottis, like the diaphragm contracting, the abdominal wall muscles contracting, building, spasmodically building pressure inside the torso. So this is dry retching because nothing's coming up yet. And then we get to the third stage, emesis or vomition. You take a deep breath. The glottis closes. The diaphragm is contracted. The pressure inside the thorax is reduced. The larynx is elevated, and by doing that, the upper esophageal sphincter is opened, but the airway is closed. And by reducing the pressure inside the thorax, by taking that deep breath, the esophagus can now open and the lower esophageal sphincter can open. The small intestine is doing its reverse peristalsis and sending contents into the stomach. The pyloric sphincter of the stomach closes, the antrum contracts, the fundus and the body of the stomach relaxes, and the abdominal muscles contract powerfully. And now, because as that pressure increases, because the airway is closed and the esophagus is open, the contents of the stomach go that way and out. And hopefully, the muscles of the soft palate have elevated the soft palate so that the contents of the stomach go out the mouth and not out of the nose, but it doesn't always work like that. One other thing that happens before all of that is increased salivation. There's the sublingual and submandibular salivary glands here. The parotid salivary gland would be there. Saliva is produced into the oral cavity to protect the teeth from the stomach acid. It's a very well organized sequence of events, isn't it, for it to do its thing? Okay, so what are the parts of the brainstem responsible for that sequence of events then? So here's the brain. And here's the brainstem down here, medulla, pons, midbrain. This is all happening in the medulla. Like I said, those chemoreceptors are in the medulla. We've talked about cranial nerves 8, 9, and 10 as carrying various sensory inputs into the brainstem. So they're here, and those sensory inputs will generally be going into the solitary nucleus or the solitary tract, it's got a whole bunch of names. The centers of the brainstem involved in vomiting are actually called the vomition centers, and they're on either side of the brainstem, so they're on both sides. And they're tied, well, they're part of the reticular formation, which indicates how they're tied into lots of things. And I was talking about those different sensory inputs. But there are 3 major nuclei or groups of nuclei that I'm going to talk about. First of all, the nucleus ambiguus. Now, the nucleus ambiguus in the medulla is it's a somatic motor nucleus. So it's sending out. So a nucleus is a collection of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. So those neurons are sending their axons out to skeletal muscle, so muscle that you can control, namely the muscles in the pharynx, the muscles in the larynx, and that sort of thing, the muscles of the soft palate. So those neurons are going to go out as parts of cranial nerves 9, 10, glossopharyngeal, vagus. We're most interested in the vagus nerve, right? Those somatic motor neurons, some of them will run to the soft palate and elevate the soft palate, stop it going out your nose. Some of them will go to the muscles of the pharynx, which will lift the larynx and help open that upper esophageal sphincter. And some will pass down the neck in the vagus nerve and then leave as the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which on the left loops around the aorta, on the right loops around the subclavian artery, and then runs back up the trachea, larynx. So these are the recurrent laryngeal nerves then. Branches of the vagus nerve carrying those neurons from the nucleus ambiguous up to the intrinsic muscles of the larynx, the muscles responsible for closing the glottis, for protecting the airway. So that's really important, that during vomiting it goes out and doesn't go down the airway. That would be bad for a number of reasons. It's acidic, but also stuff going in the airway causes infection and so on and so on. So the vagus nerve is responsible for that. If we go back to the brainstem, we go back to the medulla, there's another nucleus in here, the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, and this is a parasympathetic nucleus. So again, this is a collection of neuron cell bodies. These are preganglionic parasympathetic neurons. This means that they're going to be motor, they're going to drive some smooth muscle somewhere, and those neurons are going to leave with the vagus nerve and then run down to the lower esophagus, the stomach, the gastrointestinal tract. As we descend down the esophagus, we go from a somatic end, an end we're aware of, an end we can feel, to an autonomic end, an end we can't control, and an end we can't really feel, we're not really aware of. So these parasympathetic neurons of the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, it's those neurons that are going to be innervating the lower esophagus and cause it to relax, and the lower esophageal sphincter and cause it to relax, and they're the ones that are going to run to the stomach and cause parts of it to relax and parts of it to contract, and they're the ones that are also going to innervate the small intestine and get that retrograde, that reverse flow of contents from the small intestine back into the stomach. So that's the parasympathetic part. Muscles. So here's the diaphragm here, this dome, it domes anteriorly as well. See if I can put a bit of this back together. And here we can see the cut edges of the 3 layers of abdominal wall musculature that surround all of this. So we have the abdomen here, which is in a muscular compartment, separated from the thorax by the muscular diaphragm. And these are all somatic muscles, right? This is all skeletal muscle. This is all stuff that we can choose to control and move. And then here are the ribs, and in between the ribs we have the intercostal muscles. So, were you here when we were talking about breathing and the reflexes of breathing and respiration and stuff? Because that was a fun one. And we talked about groups of nuclei that controlled these movements. Well, the ventral respiratory group, nuclei, so also in the brainstem, also in the medulla, the ventral respiratory group are nuclei in the medulla of somatic motor neurons that are going to innervate the skeletal muscle here. So outflow from the ventral respiratory group will go to the intercostal muscles between the ribs, will go to the diaphragm, will go to the abdominal wall musculature. So the ventral respiratory group then will be triggered to cause that contraction of the diaphragm, contraction of the external intercostal muscles that lift up the rib cage, to increase the, for inspiration, for taking volume into the thorax and reducing the pressure inside the thorax to open up the esophagus, and then to keep the diaphragm contracted and to contract the layers of muscle of the abdominal wall to increase the pressure here to force the contents of the stomach out through the esophagus up and down. So the ventral respiratory group, the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, and the nucleus ambiguous are the motor outflow from the vomition centers that cause this vomiting reflex. Pretty neat, right? There's a lot going on here. Vomiting then, it is a reflex. There are sensory inputs which reflexively give motor outputs and cause a coordinated sequence of events and a carefully choreographed sequence of events, otherwise it wouldn't work. So we have sensory inputs, maybe from pathogenic bacteria or toxins in the stomach, maybe from higher functions of the limbic system and disgust, maybe from a physical object at the back of the pharynx. Different sensory inputs into the brainstem, into the medulla, into those vomitian centers can then trigger that sequence of events through the nucleus ambiguus, the ventral respiratory group, the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, to cause the larynx to be elevated and closed, to open up the upper esophageal sphincter, to cause the diaphragm to contract, to reduce the pressure inside the chest, to open up the esophagus against a closed glottis, to cause the small intestine to work backwards and send the contents back into the stomach, to cause the stomach to relax at one end and contract from the pyloric sphincter and the antrum, and then to contract also all of the abdominal muscles spasmodically and reflexively alongside all of that to push the contents in the stomach and the intestine out through the esophagus, up and out. Here's one interesting thing here. This is a vagal response, a vagal reflex, isn't it, in some cases? Because the vagus nerve is carrying sensory information from the stomach and the small intestine back to the brainstem, and then the vagus nerve is carrying a lot of that motor information back out again to trigger the other bit. People talk a lot about the vagus nerve and how they must stimulate their vagus nerve. You don't want to stimulate it like that. You don't want to stimulate it like this, do you? Anyway, a vagal response. I quite like that. But I am sick of talking about sick now. And so humans have evolved to eat food in social groups. So we've evolved this disgust so that if one member of the group is sick, the sounds of that, the smell of that is likely to make other members of the group also sick because we've shared the same food source, so it's a protective thing. So I'm kind of done talking about this because it's not making me feel great. I would like to talk about anything else, but interesting anatomy. Right, see you next week.